Hi everybody, this is our book club presentation on Sicker, Fatter, Poorer, which is a book about endocrine disrupting chemicals and what they do to human bodies. My name is Alyssa and I'm presenting alongside Jack, Scott, Sophia, and Steven.
So one group of contaminants discussed often in this book were endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs for short. I know we've talked about these a little bit in class, but they are defined as a chemical that is able to mimic, block, or otherwise interfere with the functioning of hormones in an organism. So in this chapter, the author, who is a physician and did take the human health angle in this book, looked at the various ways that these endocrine disrupting chemicals could affect humans. And in this slide, I'm specifically going to talk about the brain and nervous system. So in this chapter of his book, the types of EDCs he talked most about were flame retardants, a big one being PBDE. Those are things that are in furniture, synthetic fabrics, carpeting, flooring, etc., as well as certain pesticides. So the mechanism that he highlighted for the concern between nervous system development and endocrine disrupting chemicals started off with a discussion of the hit and run effect, how these chemicals could, you could be exposed to these chemicals early in life, briefly even, and by the time that there is any indication that something is wrong, it is too late to really go back and see what you were exposed to. You've already metabolized it and cleared it, making it difficult to study and understand. And the way that these chemicals are able to interfere with brain development in the nervous system more generally is related to improper functioning of the thyroid hormone system. So thyroid hormone, known best for its involvement in growth and development, is also crucial for the maturation of parts of the brain that are implicated in different kinds of developmental disorders, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, it's a learning disability, as well as autism. So those regions are the prefrontal cortex and cerebellum that he talked about specifically in the book. And the way that they are able to cause an improper functioning is because of their chemical and their structural similarities to naturally occurring hormones. This induces biological effects that weren't intended by the product themselves. But the actual impact, the author and a group of people he was studying with came out to estimate that 4,400 children in the US develop ADHD because of endocrine disrupting chemical exposure during their development, as well as 2 to 10%, anywhere in there, of children with autism could have developed such a condition because of endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Now, the next main topic that Dr. Trissan speaks about is endocrine disrupting compounds and how they affect obesity. Now, he starts by labeling chemicals that contribute to obesity and its adverse effects as obesogens. Now, one of the effective aspects of this chapter is that he acknowledges that metabolism is complicated and that chemicals interact with metabolism in many ways. For example, changes in testosterone and estrogen balance greatly impact metabolism and bodily response, which, as we go into later, there are many chemicals that impact testosterone and estrogen balance. He also acknowledges that they can alter genetic expression and create a thrifty phenotype, or a phenotype that comes up in response to the environment frequently. This makes it even harder to track, because even if genetics would suggest that someone would have a higher metabolism, they may have a slower one due to this thrifty phenotype. He also acknowledges the statistics on obesity. 35% of children in the US are obese, and 40% of adults are obese. And an additional 30% of adults are overweight, which makes 70% in total that are overweight or obese, which is a very high number. And because he loves quantifying things, in monetary value, $190 billion per year are spent on obesity-related conditions in the United States. I don't know how many jumbo jets this is, but quite a few, I assume. Now, you may be like, oh, well, many aspects of American life have changed that could influence obesity. For example, activity has gone down. Well, one thing that he also points out is that Americans are more active now than in the past. People are more conscious about their physical activity. But he also points out that an American now with the same diet and exercise as an American from the 90s has a BMI that is 2.3 points higher than back then. So clearly there are some other factors at play here outside of just diet and exercise, which is not what people would typically expect. Now, he goes on to give some examples of obesogens. The first example that he gives is TBT, which is a biocide that's found in plastic food packaging. And this activates receptors in the body that alter DNA expression, which ultimately changes how insulin is produced, which can cause negative effects and can cause diabetes in several cases. Another example he gives is PFOA, which is an industrial surfactant and is used to make materials stain resistant. It's used in things such as nonstick pans and clothing. And he found a correlation between high levels of PFOA and lower metabolism rates. So he found that PFOA, which can remain in the body for a long time, can lower metabolism. The two chemicals that he loves to bring up in this book are phthalates and BPA. And of course, he brings this up in this chapter as potential obesogens. So phthalates are used to make plastic more durable, flexible, and they're found about everywhere in everything that is made of plastic. But the problem with phthalates is that they can also activate receptors that alter DNA expression, and this changes caloric distribution to favor fat building over protein, which can cause many issues. And he also speculates that they may lower testosterone levels, which can additionally affect how the body uses calories and what they're sent to, and can cause several health effects that are not even related to obesity. And additionally, he brings up BPA because, of course, he does, because he loves bringing up BPA. But BPA is used to create most plastics, but he found that BPA can increase the size of fat cells, make heart disease more dangerous, and increases estrogen development. So all these chemicals he found to be potential obesogens and can cause several adverse effects for the human body.
So in chapters 5 and 6, the book switches to talking about some EDC mediated adverse reproductive effects. And these effects are numerous, and they're seen in both male and females who are exposed to EDCs. And it's also important to note that these reproductive effects are usually seen starting with the embryonic development. So if a pregnant woman is exposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals, that exposure during those really important developmental stages can result in some of these adverse reproductive effects. So in males, the proposed mechanism of action is that EDC works as a synthetic estrogen and messes with hormone receptors, which then alters hormone synthesis and action, and that ends up resulting in altered molecular pathways, which causes a variety of dysfunctions amongst the reproductive cells and also reproductive development. So we see both reproductive diseases along with disorders that are caused by malformations. So the first one of those is testicular dysgenesis syndrome, and this applies to umbrella of conditions, with the two most common being a misplaced urethra or undescended testes, and these are both disorders that cause some reproductive dysfunction, and for the misplaced urethra, that usually needs to be corrected with surgery. You also see decreased testosterone function, and that causes a variety of different disorders, including low sperm count and erectile dysfunction. And so those can also play into infertility, and we see some other damages resulting in infertility, like impaired sperm mobility, decreased concentration and volume of sperm, and cellular and DNA damage on those sperm cells. And so those cause a variety of issues with the male population, and some of those can be long-lasting and some of those can be corrected, but most of these conditions are also connected to increased risk of testicular cancer. In females, that mechanism of action is pretty similar, where EDCs act as a synthetic estrogen and alter different hormone receptors and pathways and cause dysfunction. But also EDC-mediated DNA methylation, histone modification, and the production of non-coding RNAs might serve as a possible mechanism of action for increased breast cancer risk. So alongside increased breast cancer risk, we also see things like ovarian dysgenesis, like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, fibroids, endometriosis, abnormal vaginal tissue, and early menopause. And some examples of those would be that BPA, DDT, and phthalate exposures have been linked to increased risk of PCOS, fibroids, and endometriosis. And that EDC levels in serum and fat samples exhibited substantial increases in fibroid development, endometriosis, and breast cancer risk. And there's approximately 15,000 premenopausal breast cancer cases attributed to DDT exposure annually, and an estimated approximately 90,000 cases of endometriosis attributed to phthalate exposure. And so possible biomarker of EDC exposure and the adverse reproductive effects associated with EDC exposure is anogenital distance. And so I linked a study here if you guys want to learn more about that. But the AGD is the distance between the genitals and the anus. And its first trimester phthalate exposure has been linked with decreased AGD length, and that's associated with low sperm counts in males and increased PCOS in females.
So the author talks about how the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals do not stop with adverse health effects in humans. He talks about how macroeconomically we're being punished every year for these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So first and foremost, he talks about in vitro fertilization and other fertility technologies. So it's no surprise that endocrine disrupting chemicals disrupt people's ability to reproduce effectively. And people, when they can't reproduce, they spend money on fertility assistance, and these technologies are very expensive, and they cost billions of dollars every year for Americans to use. And he claims that this is, at least in part, due to endocrine disrupting chemicals. Similarly, heart disease, obesity are both epidemics in the United States. For example, he claims that BPA alone contributes around $2 billion worth of healthcare costs to heart disease. So just BPA alone is $2 billion. Similarly, with cancers, cancer is incredibly expensive. We spend billions of dollars on research and treatment every year. Some of these cancers may be caused by endocrine disrupting chemicals. A more atypical view and a more atypical aspect of the way that endocrine disrupting chemicals cause financial harm is by neurological disorders. So the first way that they cause increased economic burden is it's expensive to educate people with ADHD, ADD, autism, and other neurological dysfunctions. They require a lower faculty to student ratio. They require additional resources to ensure that they can be educated effectively, and those resources unfortunately cost money. Additionally, as far as neurological dysfunction goes, the author claims that it costs $20,000 per person per IQ point lost throughout their lifetime in lost economic productivity. So he claims that for every IQ point a person loses, they lose $20,000 of economic productivity, and that really adds up over a population that is being made dumber, frankly, by endocrine disrupting chemicals. So he asserts that all of this, the sum of all of this, costs for treatments due to the harm that endocrine disrupting chemicals cause, and also lost productivity from decreased intelligence or early death, amount to approximately $400 billion annually. So the author posits that this should be at least a partial driver of change, because there's a huge financial incentive for these endocrine disrupting chemicals to be managed more effectively. So the author asserts that it is our responsibility to help alleviate some of this economic burden that we see due to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So he claims that there's a large externality in the current way that we produce and sell goods. So here we have an object that is, in this case, an organic apple that is more expensive than a endocrine disrupting containing apple, as he would claim. I chose the example of an apple because we've all been to the grocery store and we've all had to make choices when buying goods, but we can also see this pattern emerging with BPA-free cans, with phthalate-free shampoos, and with fire retardant clothing. So he claims it is the responsibility of the consumer to know the fact that these products may be more expensive, but they will not contain endocrine disrupting chemicals, which will negatively affect them or potentially their children if they're pregnant or something like that. I think this is a little bit disingenuous at times because millions of Americans don't have access to fresh fruit, let alone organic fruit. And then beyond that, it's an economic burden. And how do you tell a mother who can barely afford to feed her family that she's not, she's doing them a disservice by not buying organic? It just seems a little bit silly to me. And the author doesn't really address that, but what he does say is that to get this virtuous cycle, as he calls it, underway, the government should step in to subsidize these products that contain these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I think this is a largely good idea in principle. It'd be interesting to see it played out in practice. However, he claims that the government should seed these virtuous cycles and also aid in education for individuals to know that these endocrine disrupting chemicals are hurting them, and then potentially to incentivize them to purchase ones that are free of those endocrine disrupting chemicals. I think this is a lovely thought. However, individuals, whether through apathy or ignorance, choose products that are a detriment to their health. I mean, we can see millions of Americans smoke or chew or whatever. I mean, millions of Americans drink, gamble. It doesn't seem very plausible to me that the United States government can snap their fingers on what's going to amount to billions of dollars of subsidies just for individuals to make choices that negatively affect their health. However, he does make a point that endocrine disrupting chemicals are incredibly expensive to us, and who is footing the bill for that $400 billion as he assesses annually? And currently, the answer is the population is as a whole. So a lot of these companies are not being held responsible for the endocrine disrupting chemicals that they're inserting into our environment, and I think that's a problem. And frankly, the author doesn't have a good solution on how to hold them responsible for those externalities, but I don't really think anyone does. So that really underscores the economic aspect and how we're in a little bit of a conundrum economically with a lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. But this is an excellent portion of the book because it highlights how, as humans, we're often concerned about how they will affect our health, and we're rarely concerned about how they'll affect our wallets, even though the effect to our wallets is in fact great. And thank you.
As Dr. Tresande approached the conclusion of his book, he outlined ways for his audience to take action and make a difference. After describing the horrors of endocrine disrupting chemicals, he anticipated that readers would struggle to cope with the burden of their newfound knowledge. To reduce our fears, he highlighted key strategies to limit our exposure to 4 endocrine disruptors: pesticides, phthalates, BPA, and flame retardants. For pesticides, we're in luck. In America, the Food Quality Protection Act reduces organophosphate residues in our food. Notably, this act contributes to American excellence, as our organophosphate residue concentrations are generally lower than those in Europe. However, we still need to be cautious about what we eat. Per the Environmental Working Group, which was cited in Sicker, Fatter, Poorer, we need to avoid the terrible 12 foods, which all retain pesticide residues more than other produce. For these foods, it is especially important to scrub and avoid eating the outermost skin. An additional way to avoid exposure to pesticides is to purchase organic foods. In short, the best way to reduce our exposure to phthalates is to eat fresh foods. By fresh, I mean foods that are not preserved or frozen in packaging constructed with harmful chemicals. If it is necessary to eat frozen or canned foods, it's best to at least avoid containers that could contaminate the food during storage. It's best to use glass or stainless steel as opposed to plastic or cans. When using plastic, check the recycling number to determine whether the product was made with phthalates. Last, avoid microwaving or placing plastic containers in the dishwasher. These activities can cause increased phthalate leaching into your food. We're exposed to BPAs through two sources: canned foods and beverages, and thermal paper receipts. While it's surprising to hear the danger of extra long receipts from CVS, our greatest risk comes from cans. As such, avoiding canned foods and beverages as much as possible can limit our BPA exposure. Further, it may be worthwhile to discuss stricter regulations of BPA in food products. Regardless, we can vote with our consumer choices by seeking out BPA-free options. Last, to reduce your exposure to flame retardants, you should throw away all furniture in your home that contains foam. If that's not feasible for you, the next best thing is to replace any damaged furniture that has exposed foam, or at least cover the exposed area with a slip. When buying all new furniture, select options with natural fibers like wool. Opening the windows for fresh air and vacuuming frequently with a HEPA filter can also reduce your overall exposure to flame retardants. Last, be sure you are consuming sufficient iodine, which likely most American citizens are.